When I got back from my knee surgery, I stood on my own front porch with a hospital band still wrapped around my wrist, and my key didn't fit the lock. I tried it again, slower this time, steadying my hand against the white wooden frame Daniel had painted for me 10 summers ago, but the key stopped halfway and like it didn't belong there anymore. The late October air in Columbus had a bite to it, and I could feel it through the thin cotton of my cardigan as I shifted my weight, careful with the stitches in my knee. The discharge nurse had told me not to stand too long, not to put pressure on it yet. Funny how life doesn't wait for medical advice. I glanced down at the small paper bag in my hand, pain medication, a bottle of water, and the printed instructions I had folded twice and tucked inside like they could somehow keep things organized. Behind me, the hospital shuttle driver had already pulled away, tires crunching over dry leaves, leaving me alone on a porch that suddenly didn't feel like mine. I leaned closer to the door, noticing something I hadn't seen at first. There was a small black keypad just above the handle that hadn't been there before. I pressed one of the buttons out of instinct, and it beeped softly, almost politely, as if to say I was not authorized. I let out a slow breath and reached into my purse for my phone. My fingers brushed past a receipt from Kroger, a tube of lipstick I hadn't worn in weeks, and finally landed on the phone. Before I could dial, I heard a voice from next door. Evelyn. I turned carefully, wincing just a little, and saw Mrs. Collins standing by her mailbox, her gray coat buttoned all the way up. She looked at me the way people look at something they don't quite understand. I thought you already left, she said. I frowned. Left where? She hesitated, then stepped a little closer to the edge of her yard. Your daughter-in-law told everyone you moved out. Said you were going to one of those senior communities closer to the hospital. For a second, I just stood there, the words settling in like dust in a quiet room. Then I gave a small, polite smile, the kind I'd learned over 40 years. Of teaching first graders when something didn't make sense, but panic wouldn't help. Well, I said, adjusting my grip on the railing, that's news to me. I turned back to the door and tried the key one more time, pressing harder this time, as if determination could change metal. It didn't. The lock held firm. I straightened slowly, my knee protesting, and dialed Daniel's number. It rang twice before he picked up. Hey, Mom, he said, his tone easy, distracted, like he was in the middle of something else. I'm home, I said, keeping my voice even. But I can't get inside. There was a pause, not long, but long enough. You're home, he repeated. In the background, I could hear Claire's voice, low but sharp, saying something I couldn't quite make out. Then Daniel came back on. Mom, you should have told us you were coming today. I looked at the front door, at the keypad, at the lock that no longer recognized me. Daniel, I said quietly, this is my house. Another pause. This one heavier. Let's just talk when I get there, he replied. The line went dead a second later. I lowered the phone slowly, my reflection faint in the glass panel beside the door. Same silver hair, same face, but something underneath it all had shifted. Mrs. Collins was still watching from next door, pretending to sort her mail now. I set my bag down carefully on the porch bench, then reached out and ran my fingers along the edge of the door frame, feeling the fresh paint, the smoothness of something recently changed. I hadn't authorized any of this. I knew that much. And yet, somehow, everything about this house was already acting like I no longer belonged here. I picked up my phone again, this time opening the photo I had taken just 2 weeks ago, me standing in this very doorway, smiling, holding the casserole dish I'd made for Daniel and Claire before my surgery. Same door, same house, different reality. And as I stare at that photo, one thought settled in, calm and precise. I didn't just lose my key. Someone had already decided I wasn't supposed to come back. I did not sit down again. The porch bench was right there behind me, but something in my chest told me that if I let myself settle, even for a minute, I would lose whatever small grip I still had on this moment. Instead, I picked up my bag, straightened my shoulders, and walked carefully down the front steps, one hand on the railing, the other holding my phone. Mrs. Collins was still by her mailbox, and this time she did not pretend to be busy. Evelyn, she said quietly, are you all right? I gave her a measured look. I will be. Did you see who changed the locks? She hesitated, then nodded slowly. A locksmith truck came by last week. White van. I remember because Claire was out here talking to the man for a long time. She said it was for security. Security. I let that word sit for a second. Did you happen to see any paperwork? Anything signed? Mrs. Collins shook her head. No, but there were boxes. A lot of them. They were carrying things out of the house. I assumed, she trailed off, that I knew about it. I finished for her. She gave me a sympathetic look, the kind that felt too close to pity for my liking. Thank you, I said, keeping my tone steady. That helps. It did more than help. It confirmed this was not confusion. This was organized. I turned and made my way down the short walkway to the driveway, my knees stiff but manageable. The concrete still had the faint oil stain from Daniel's first car, a detail that used to make me smile. Today, it just felt like evidence that time had moved forward without asking me. I reached my car, a silver Toyota Camry I had owned for 8 years, and leaned against the door for a moment before unlocking it. The familiar click grounded me. Inside, everything was exactly where I'd left it. A pair of reading glasses in the center console. A reusable grocery bag on the passenger seat. My world, contained in a space no one had thought to take yet. I slid into the driver's seat carefully and set my purse on my lap. Then I paused. If Claire had arranged for a locksmith, if boxes had been moved, if the story being told to neighbors was that I had relocated, then this was already bigger than a misunderstanding at the front door. I reached into my purse again and pulled out the folded discharge papers. My name was printed clearly at the top. Evelyn Harper. Same name that had been on this house deed for over 30 years. Same name that had paid every property tax bill, every utility, every repair. I unfolded the paper completely, smoothing it against the steering wheel, and something caught my eye that had not mattered before. Under emergency contact, it listed Claire Harper. I stared at it for a second longer than necessary. I did not remember authorizing that change. I had always listed Daniel, not Claire. A small detail, easy to overlook, but it shifted something in my mind. I picked up my phone again and opened my banking app. The signal was weak, so I started the engine, letting the car idle while it connected. The familiar login screen appeared, and I entered my password. For a moment, everything looked normal. Then I noticed the balance. It was lower than I expected. Not dramatically, but enough to make me frown. I tapped into the recent transactions. A line item near the top caught my attention. Property services transfer, $42,000. The date was 3 days after my surgery. I felt my fingers tighten slightly around the phone. I did not approve any transfer. Not for that amount. Not for anything labeled like that. I scrolled further, my heart steady, but my thoughts sharpening. The transaction included a reference number and a note. Authorized under account holder instruction. I let out a slow breath and leaned back against the seat. Claire had arranged the locksmith. Claire had told the neighbors I moved. Claire was listed as my emergency contact. And now there was money missing, tied to property services right when I was recovering and not fully aware of anything beyond pain medication schedules and follow-up appointments. I looked up at the house through the windshield. Same windows, same curtains, but it was starting to look less like a home and more like a transaction I had never agreed to. My phone buzzed in my hand, breaking the silence. Daniel. I answered. Mom, he said, his voice tighter this time. Claire and I are on our way. Just stay there, okay? I glanced at the front door, at the keypad that had replaced my key. I'm not going anywhere, I replied. There was a pause. Then he said, we need to explain a few things. I ended the call before he could say anything else. Explain. That was an interesting choice of words. I placed the phone on the dashboard and looked back down at the transaction details, memorizing the amount, the date, the reference number. Because whatever they were about to explain, I had a feeling it would not match what was already written in front of me. I stayed in the car, engine still running, the soft hum filling the silence while I watched the house through the windshield. It felt strange, sitting in my own driveway like a visitor waiting for permission. 5 minutes passed, then 10. I used that time. I opened my glove compartment and pulled out the small folder where I kept copies of important documents, insurance cards, registration, and a folded property tax receipt from earlier that year. I unfolded it carefully. My name was there in black ink. Evelyn Harper, property owner. The amount paid in full, stamped by the Franklin County Treasurer. That was April. 6 months ago. Nothing about this situation lined up with the paper in my hands. A black SUV turned onto the street, slow, deliberate. Claire always drove like that, controlled, never rushed. It pulled into the driveway beside me, and for a second, neither of them got out. Then Daniel stepped out first, adjusting his jacket like he was arriving at a meeting instead of coming home. Claire followed, composed as ever, her hair pulled back neatly, her expression already set before she even looked at me. I opened my door and stepped out, steadying myself against the frame. "You changed the locks," I said, not raising my voice, just placing the fact between us. Claire did not answer right away. She glanced at Daniel, then back at me. "We upgraded the security system," she replied evenly. "That is not what I asked." Daniel stepped forward slightly, hands in his pockets. "Mom, let's just talk inside." I looked past him at the door, at the keypad, then back at him. "I cannot get inside." That landed. He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "Okay," he said, softer now. "Okay, I get how this looks." Claire crossed her arms, her tone still calm but firmer. "Evelyn, this is exactly why we wanted to handle things before your surgery. So you would not have to deal with stress like this." I held her gaze. Handle what exactly? For a moment there was a flicker, something small but real. Then she smoothed it over. "The house," she said. "The paperwork. The transition." Transition. That word did not belong anywhere near my front door. I took a step closer, ignoring the pull on my knee. "What paperwork?" Daniel looked at Claire again, and this time I saw it clearly. He was waiting for her to lead. That was new. When he was younger, he used to answer first, used to step in front of problems, not behind someone else's words. "Mom," he said carefully, "you signed documents before your surgery. Remember? Claire helped you go through them." I did remember the clipboard, the pages, the way Claire had flipped through them quickly, pointing to where I needed to sign. I had trusted the moment because it felt routine, because hospitals are full of forms and signatures and things you do without questioning every line. I looked at him steadily. I signed medical forms, insurance, consent. Claire shook her head slightly. There were additional documents. Power of attorney. Temporary, just to make things easier while you were recovering. The words settled in slowly, each one heavier than the last. Temporary, I repeated. Then why is my key not working? Silence stretched between us. A car drove past at the end of the street. A dog barked somewhere in the distance. And the world kept moving like this was just another afternoon. Claire broke the silence first. "Because the house is now under Daniel's name," she said, her voice measured, almost rehearsed. "It is more practical that way. You will still be taken care of course." I felt something shift inside me then, not a collapse, not panic, but a quiet alignment. Pieces that had not made sense before began to settle into place. The locksmith, the boxes, the neighbor's story, the bank transfer, the emergency contact change. I looked at Daniel. "Is that true?" He hesitated, and in that hesitation, I had my answer. "It was the best decision," he said finally, not meeting my eyes. I nodded once slowly. "For who?" Neither of them answered. I let the question hang there, then turned slightly, reaching into my car and picking up the folded property tax receipt. I held it up between us. "This says something different." Claire's eyes flicked to the paper, just for a second, but it was enough. "That is outdated," she replied quickly. "The records have been updated." Updated. I folded the paper carefully and placed it back in the folder. "Then I think it is time I see those records," I said. Daniel shifted his weight. "Mom, let's not escalate this." I looked at him, really looked this time, and spoke in a tone he had not heard from me in years. "I'm not escalating anything. I am asking for proof." Claire's posture tightened slightly, the first real crack in her control. "We can show you," she said, "but not here. Not like this." I closed my car door gently and met her gaze again. "Then where?" For a moment, she said nothing. Then she glanced at Daniel and gave a small nod, as if confirming something already decided. "Tomorrow morning," she said, "at the attorney's office." I held her eyes for a second longer, then inclined my head just slightly. "Good," I said, "because I have a few questions of my own." As they turned back toward the house, entering with a code I did not know, I stood there in the driveway, watching the door close behind them. And for the first time since I stepped onto that porch, I was not wondering what had happened. I was wondering how far they had gone and whether they had already counted on me never asking. I did not drive away right after they went inside. Instead, I turned off the engine and sat there for a moment, letting the quiet settle around me like a decision forming. If they expected me to wait until tomorrow to understand what they had done, they had misjudged me. I started the car again, this time with purpose, and pulled out of the driveway slowly, my eyes catching one last detail in the side mirror. The new keypad glowing faintly beside the door, as if it had always been there. It had not. 10 minutes later, I was parked outside my bank, a small brick building with a blue awning and a flag out front that moved gently in the wind. I had been coming here for over 20 years. They knew my name. That mattered. I stepped inside, the bell above the door chiming softly, and the familiar smell of paper and polished counters greeted me. Mark, the teller, looked up and blinked in surprise. Mrs. Harper? I thought you were recovering. I am, I said, offering a small smile as I walked up to the counter. But I need to check something. He nodded and pulled up my account. I slid my driver's license across the counter, watching closely as he entered the information. His expression shifted just slightly when the screen loaded. Is everything all right? I asked. He hesitated, then turned the monitor slightly toward himself, as if deciding how much to say. There have been some recent changes to your account permissions, he said carefully. Changes? I repeated. He nodded. There is an active power of attorney listed. Claire Harper. The name landed exactly where I expected it to, but hearing it confirmed in this setting, on an official system, changed the weight of it. When was that added? I asked. Mark clicked through a few screens. 2 weeks ago, he said. It was processed in person. All documents were notarized. 2 weeks ago, before my surgery, I rested my hands lightly on the counter. I would like copies of everything connected to that authorization, I said. He studied my face for a second, then nodded. Of course. While he printed the documents, I glanced around the bank. A man in a baseball cap filling out a deposit slip. A woman counting cash at the next window. Ordinary life continuing, unaware that mine had just been rewritten on paper. Mark returned with a small stack of documents and placed them in front of me. These are the forms submitted, he said. And this is the transaction record tied to the authorization. I picked up the first page. My name was printed clearly at the top. Evelyn Harper. Beneath it, a signature that looked like mine, but something about it felt off. Not wrong enough to reject outright, but not quite the way my hand moved when I signed my name without thinking. I turned to the next page. Durable power of attorney. Effective immediately. Granting authority over financial and property decisions. I felt my jaw set slightly. Was I here when this was signed? I asked. Mark shook his head. No, ma'am. The documents were brought in by Mrs. Harper. She had identification and the notarization was already completed. I looked up at him. So you accepted legal control of my accounts without seeing me? He shifted uncomfortably. The paperwork met all requirements, he said. Everything appeared valid. I nodded once. Of course it did. I moved to the final page, the transaction record. The same $42,000 transfer I had seen on my phone, but now with more detail. Destination, Midwest Property Services, LLC. Authorized by Claire Harper, under power of attorney. Timestamp, 10:14 a.m. I closed my eyes briefly, then opened them again, sharper now. Do you have the contact information for that company? I asked. Mark checked the screen and wrote down an address and phone number on a small slip of paper. I took it and folded it carefully, placing it inside my folder with the other documents. Evidence. Not assumptions. Not feelings. Evidence. I gathered the papers and looked back at Mark. Thank you, I said. You have been very helpful. He gave a small nod. If you need anything else, Mrs. Harper, I will, I replied. I turned and walked out of the bank, the glass door closing softly behind me. The air outside felt different now, clearer somehow. I got back into my car and placed the folder on the passenger seat, my eyes lingering on the name printed across the top of every page. Claire Harper. Not just involved. Authorized. I picked up the slip of paper with the company's name and address and stared at it for a long second. Midwest Property Services, LLC. If that money had gone there, then something had been purchased, transferred, or changed under my name. And whatever it was already in motion before I even stepped into that operating room. I started the engine again, my hands steady on the wheel, because tomorrow at the attorney's office was no longer where this story began to unfold. It was where I would walk in already knowing more than they expected. I did not go home. Not yet. Instead, I followed the address Mark had written down, driving across town past a row of auto repair shops and a strip mall with a half-empty parking lot, until the GPS led me to a low beige building with a faded sign that read Midwest Property Services, LLC. It looked more like a storage office than anything else, the kind of place you would not notice unless you were looking for it. I parked in front, turned off the engine, and sat there for a moment, letting the weight of what I was about to do settle into something steady. Then I stepped out, folder in hand, and walked inside. The office was small, with a front desk, a couple of metal chairs, and a bulletin board covered in business cards and faded flyers. A man in his 50s sat behind the desk, glasses low on his nose, typing on a keyboard. He looked up when I entered. "Can I help you?" he asked. I placed the folded slip of paper on the counter. "I believe your company processed a transaction tied to my property," I said. "I would like to know what service was provided." He glanced at the paper, then at me. "Name, Evelyn Harper." He typed for a few seconds, then paused. His expression changed just enough for me to notice. "Yes," he said slowly. "There was a contract under that name." "For what?" I asked. He hesitated, then turned his monitor slightly away, as if deciding how much to reveal. "Property preparation and transfer services," he said. "We were contracted to coordinate documentation and facilitate ownership transition." Ownership transition. The phrase echoed in my mind, colder now, sharper. "Who hired you?" I asked. "Claire Harper," he replied. No hesitation this time. She presented power of attorney documentation and requested expedited handling. I nodded once, keeping my voice level. "And what exactly was transferred?" He clicked again, then pulled a file from a drawer beside him and opened it. "The residential property listed under your name," he said, tapping a line with his pen. "Deed reassignment to Daniel Harper." I stepped closer, ignoring the pull in my knee, and looked at the document. There it was. My address. My house. And beneath it, a line marked Grantor, Evelyn Harper, followed by a signature that looked like mine, but carried that same subtle difference I had seen at the bank. "When was this finalized?" I asked. 3 days ago," he said. "Everything cleared. County records should reflect the change by now." 3 days ago, while I was still managing pain medication schedules and physical therapy instructions. I let out a slow breath and straightened. "I would like copies of all documents associated with this transfer," I said. He studied me for a moment, then nodded. "I can print those," he said. "It will take a few minutes." As the printer hummed in the background, my phone buzzed in my purse. I did. Not need to check to know who it was. When I finally pulled it out, Claire's name lit up the screen. I answered. "Evelyn," she said, her tone controlled but tighter than before. "Where are you?" I glanced at the man behind the desk, at the file still open in front of him. "Out," I replied. "Handling something." There was a brief silence. "We expected you to rest today," she said. "You just had surgery." I let a small pause hang between us. "And you expected me to wait until tomorrow to understand what you have done," I said calmly. Another pause, longer this time. Then she spoke again, more direct. "The meeting with the attorney is already scheduled for 9 o'clock. It would be better if we discussed everything there." I looked down at the document in front of me, at my name printed above a signature I did not fully recognize. "Oh, I plan to be there," I said, "but I will not be arriving unprepared." I ended the call before she could respond. The printer stopped, and the man gathered the papers, handing them to me in a neat stack. "Everything we have on file," he said. I took them, feeling the weight of the pages in my hands. Not heavy in ounces, but in consequence. As I turned to leave, he added, almost as an afterthought, "For what it is worth, Mrs. Harper, everything was processed quickly. Your daughter-in-law was very insistent about the timeline." I paused at the door, then nodded slightly. "I can see that." Outside, the sky had shifted toward evening, the lights softer now, but nothing about this felt softer. I walked back to my car, placed the documents carefully on the passenger seat, and sat down behind the wheel. For a moment, I just looked at the top page, the deed transfer, the date, the signatures. They had not just planned this. They had rushed it. And that meant one thing. They had been working against a deadline. I started the engine slowly, my eyes still on the paper. Because if they had needed to move this quickly, then there was something they were afraid I might discover if they did not. I did not drive straight back to the house. Instead, I pulled into a small diner a few blocks away, the kind with a neon open sign in the window, and a row of parked pickup trucks out front. I needed a place to sit, to think, and more importantly, to organize what I now had. Inside, the smell of coffee and grilled food wrapped around me as I slid into a booth near the window, easing myself down carefully to protect my knee. A waitress in her 50s came over with a pot of coffee and a notepad. "Just coffee for now?" she asked. "Yes, please," I said, offering a polite smile. When she poured, I thanked her and waited until she moved on before opening the folder on the table. I laid the documents out one by one, aligning them neatly. Bank authorization, power of attorney, property transfer. Every page told the same story, but now I was reading it differently. Not as a victim trying to understand, but as someone looking for a weakness. My eyes returned to the timeline. Power of attorney filed 2 weeks ago. Deed transfer finalized 3 days ago. Surgery in between. That was not coincidence. That was structure. I picked up my phone and scrolled through my call history, stopping at a number I had not used in over a year. Robert Green, estate attorney. He had handled my late husband's will, and more importantly, he had been very particular about documentation. I tapped the number and waited. It rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "Green and Associates." "Mr. Green, this is Evelyn Harper." There was a brief pause, then recognition. "Mrs. Harper, it has been a while. How can I help you?" I glanced down at the papers spread across the table. I believe documents were signed under my name, granting power of attorney and transferring property ownership. I said, "I need to know how that could happen without my direct confirmation." His tone shifted immediately, more focused now. "Were you present at the time of signing?" "I was in a hospital setting, reviewing multiple forms before surgery," I replied. "I did not knowingly authorize property transfer." Another pause, this one thoughtful. "Then we need to look at capacity and intent," he said. "If you were under medical stress or not fully informed, that changes the validity." I leaned back slightly, letting that settle. Capacity and intent. Not just what was signed, but whether it should count at all. "Can you meet tomorrow morning?" I asked. "I already have an appointment scheduled with another attorney at 9. "Come to my office at 8, he said without hesitation. "Bring every document you have. We will review them before you speak to anyone else." I allowed myself a small nod, even though he could not see it. "Thank you." I ended the call and sat there for a moment, the noise of the diner continuing around me, forks against plates, low conversations, the steady rhythm of everyday life. But something had shifted. For the first time since I stood on that porch, I was no longer reacting. I was preparing. I gathered the documents again, but this time I separated them into 2 stacks. One for what they had done, one for what I could challenge. The difference mattered. As I reached for my purse, something small caught my attention. Tucked into the side pocket was a folded envelope I did not immediately recognize. I pulled out slowly. My name was written on the front in a familiar hand. My husband's. The date in the corner was from 6 months before he passed. I frowned slightly, trying to remember when I had placed it there. Then I opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, typed, signed, and notarized. A codicil, an addition to his will. My eyes moved quickly across the lines, and with each sentence, the shape of something larger began to emerge. A clause about inheritance conditions, a provision tied to treatment of the surviving spouse, and a final line that made me go very still. I read it again, slower this time, making sure I had not misunderstood. I folded the paper carefully and placed it back into the envelope, then into my purse. Outside, the light had shifted again, evening settling in. I picked up my coffee, now lukewarm, and took a small sip. Claire had moved quickly. Daniel had followed. They had built a structure around me, assuming I would not question it in time. I placed the cup back down and gathered my things. Tomorrow morning was no longer just a meeting. It was going to be a test of everything they had put into motion. And as I slid out of the booth and headed for the door, one thought stayed with me, clear and steady. They believed they had already secured the outcome. They had no idea what was already waiting for them on paper. I arrived at Mr. Green's office the next morning 10 minutes early, the sky still pale with that quiet blue that comes just before the city fully wakes up. His building sat on a corner downtown, red brick, brass handles polished from years of use. I pushed the door open and stepped inside, the scent of old paper and coffee greeting me in a way that felt strangely reassuring. This was a place where things were written down properly, where words had weight. A receptionist looked up from behind a wooden desk. "Mrs. Harper?" she asked. "Yes. He is expecting you. Right this way." She led me down a short hallway lined with framed certificates and photographs, then opened a door. Mr. Green stood as I entered, extending his hand. "Evelyn," he said warmly, then studied my face more closely. "You look like you have not had much rest." I shook his hand and gave a small, measured smile. "I have had enough," I replied. "More importantly, I have information." I placed a folder on his desk and sat down carefully, easing my knee into position. He took his seat and began going through the documents one by one, his expression growing more focused with each page. "Power of attorney," he murmured. "Notarized, processed through the bank, and then this." He paused at the deed transfer, adjusting his glasses. "Expedited filing. That is unusual." "They were in a hurry," I said. He glanced up at me. "That much is clear." He flipped to the transaction record, then back to the power of attorney. "Did you receive independent counsel before signing any of this?" "No," I said. "It was presented as routine paperwork before surgery." He leaned back slightly, steepling his fingers. "Then we have two immediate issues," he said. "Capacity and disclosure. If you were not fully informed, and if the documents were presented in a misleading context, that opens the door to challenge." I nodded once. I thought as much. He reached for a pen and made a few notes, then looked up again. "But there is something else here." He tapped the notarization stamp. This was signed off by a traveling notary, not someone tied to a hospital or a law office. I felt my attention sharpen. What does that mean? It means someone arranged for that notary to be present at a specific time and place, he said. That does not happen by accident. It is coordinated, planned, structured. Every step now had intention behind it. I reached into my purse and pulled out the envelope I had found the night before. "There is more," I said, placing it in front of him. "This was written by my husband before he passed." He opened it carefully, reading through the codicil in silence. As his eyes moved across the page, something changed in his expression. Not concern, not hesitation, something closer to recognition. He read the final line again, then set the paper down slowly. "Evelyn," he said, his tone now very precise, "did your son ever see this document?" "No, Olivia. My husband wanted it kept private unless it became necessary." Mr. Green nodded once, then leaned forward slightly. "Then this changes everything." I felt a stillness settle in my chest, not uncertainty, but focus. "Explain." He tapped the last paragraph with his pen. "Your husband included a conditional clause. Any descendant who attempts to remove you from your primary residence or manipulate your financial control forfeits their inheritance rights." He let that sit for a moment, then added, "legally enforceable, assuming we can prove intent." I did not react immediately. I let the words move through me, fitting into place alongside everything else. The locks, the transfer, the timing, the urgency. They had not just acted quickly. They had acted in a way that directly triggered something they did not even know existed. "So if we prove what they did," I began. "They stand to lose far more than a house," he finished. There was a quiet moment between us, the kind that does not need to be filled. Then I asked, "What do we do next?" He picked up his pen again, already writing. "We prepare," he said. "You will attend that meeting at 9 o'clock. You will let them speak. You will not reveal what you know yet." He looked up at me, his voice steady. And when the time is right, we introduce this. He tapped the codicil again. I nodded slowly, feeling something settle into place that had not been there before. Not just understanding. Position. For the first time since this began, I was not walking into a conversation to ask questions. I was walking in with leverage. I gathered the documents carefully, placing the codicil back into its envelope. As I stood to leave, Mr. Green added one more thing. I paused. If they moved this quickly, there may be additional actions already in motion. You need to assume this is not the full extent of it. I met his gaze. I already do. Outside, the city had fully woken up, traffic moving steadily, people heading into their day. I walked to my car with measured steps, the folder held firmly in my hand. The meeting at 9 o'clock was no longer something I was bracing for. It was something I was ready for. But as I reached for the door handle, one thought stopped me cold. If they had been willing to risk everything to take the house, what else had they already set in motion that I had not seen yet? I arrived at the attorney's office at exactly 9 o'clock, the folder tucked neatly under my arm, my steps measured and deliberate as I moved through the glass doors. The lobby was modern, all clean lines and muted tones, with a receptionist seated behind a white desk typing quietly. Claire was already there, seated with perfect posture, her hands folded in her lap, as if she had been waiting for a scheduled appointment rather than the outcome of something far more calculated. Daniel stood beside her, pacing slightly, his phone in hand. When he saw me, he stopped. "Mom," he said, stepping forward, his voice softer than before. "You made it." I said I would. I replied calmly. Claire stood then, offering a polite smile that did not quite reach her eyes. "Evelyn," she said, her tone smooth, controlled. "I'm glad you came. It is better we resolve everything properly." I gave a small nod. "I agree." The receptionist looked up. "Mr. Lawson will see you now." We were led into a conference room with a long polished table and a large window overlooking the street. A man in his late 50s stood as we entered, extending his hand. "I'm Richard Lawson," he said. "Please have a seat." I sat across from Claire and Daniel, placing my folder on the table, but keeping it closed. I noticed Claire's eyes flick briefly to it, then away. She was watching. "Good," Mr. Lawson began, with a professional tone. "I understand there have been some concerns regarding recent property and financial arrangements." Claire leaned forward slightly, taking the lead without hesitation. "Yes," she said. "We wanted to ensure Evelyn's assets were protected while she recovers. The house was becoming difficult to manage, and Daniel is better positioned to handle those responsibilities." She spoke clearly, confidently, as if she had rehearsed this explanation more than once. I turned my head slightly toward her. "Protected," I repeated. "Is that what you call changing the locks?" Daniel shifted in his chair. "Mom, it is not like that," he said quickly. "We just needed to make sure everything was secure while you were in surgery." I held his gaze. "Secure from who?" He did not answer. Claire stepped in smoothly. "Evelyn, let's focus on the bigger picture," she said. "The transfer was done legally, under proper authorization. You signed the documents. We have everything on file." Mr. Lawson nodded, sliding a set of papers across the table toward me. "These are copies of the executed documents," he said. "Power of attorney and deed transfer." I did not reach for them right away. Instead, I looked at Claire. "You seem very certain," I said. "Because I am," she replied, her voice steady. "We followed every legal step. There is nothing to dispute." There it was. Not just confidence. Finality. She believed this was already finished. I reached out then, picking up the documents and glancing through them briefly, though I already knew what they contained. The same signature, the same dates, the same structure. When I set them back down, I folded my hands lightly on the table. "And the $42,000 transfer?" I asked. Daniel blinked. "What transfer?" Claire did not move. "That was part of the property processing," she said. "Standard fees." I tilted my head slightly. "Standard," I repeated. "That seems high." Mr. Lawson cleared his throat. "Property services can vary depending on the scope," he said. Claire gave a small nod, reinforcing the point. "Everything was necessary to complete the transition efficiently," she added. Efficiently. That word again. Always tied to speed. always tied to control. I leaned back slightly in my chair, letting a quiet pause settle over the room. Then I spoke, my tone even. "Tell me something, Claire," I said. "Why was it so important to complete all of this while I was in surgery?" That landed differently. Daniel looked at her. Mr. Lawson glanced between us. Claire held her posture, but for the first time, there was a slight delay before she answered. "Timing was simply practical," she said. "You were already in a medical setting. It made the paperwork easier." I gave a small, thoughtful nod, as if considering her explanation. "I see." I reached for my folder then, opening it slowly but not yet removing anything. Claire's eyes followed the movement, just for a fraction of a second. "Enough." "Well," I said, closing the folder again gently, "I appreciate you walking me through your version of events." Daniel frowned slightly. "Our version?" he asked. I met his eyes, my expression calm, but no longer uncertain. "Yes," I said, "because now I have a clearer picture of what you believe you have done." Claire straightened slightly, her confidence returning. "There is no belief involved," she said. "This is already finalized." I held her gaze for a moment longer, then allowed a faint, almost polite smile to appear. "Is it?" I asked. The room went quiet, and in that silence I could feel it shift, just slightly, but enough to matter. Because for the first time since I walked in, Claire was no longer completely certain. And I had not even shown her the one document that could undo everything. I let the silence stretch just long enough to settle into something uncomfortable. Then I reached for the pen Mr. Lawson had placed near the documents. I did not open my folder. Not yet. Instead, I pulled the power of attorney document slightly closer and angled it toward myself, studying it as if I were seeing it for the first time. "Walk me through this part," I said, tapping lightly on the paragraph granting authority. "Just so I understand exactly what I agreed to." Claire relaxed a fraction, mistaking the request for uncertainty. "Of course," she said, leaning forward. "That section allows me to manage financial and property matters on your behalf, while you are unable to do so." "Unable," I repeated, letting the words sit between us. "Meaning what, exactly?" Mr. Lawson adjusted his glasses. "Typically, that refers to incapacity, whether medical or otherwise," he said. "It can be temporary." I nodded slowly, as if absorbing the explanation. "And who determines that incapacity?" I asked. Claire answered before he could. "It was implied by the circumstances," she said. "You were preparing for surgery. It was a precaution. A precaution." I traced my finger lightly along the edge of the paper, then lifted my gaze to Daniel. "Did you believe I was incapable of managing my own affairs?" I asked. He shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable. "Mom, it was not about that," he said. "We just thought it would be easier if Claire handled things while you recovered." I gave a small, almost thoughtful nod. "Easier for who?" He looked down at the table. That was answer enough. I picked up the pen and made a small mark in the margin of the document, not altering anything, just creating a visible point of reference. "And this signature," I continued, tapping the line where my name was written. "You are both confident this reflects informed consent." Claire's expression tightened slightly. "Evelyn, you signed it yourself," she said. "We went through everything together." I tilted my head, just enough to suggest consideration. "Did we?" I asked. The room shifted again, subtle but real. Mr. Lawson leaned forward slightly. "If there are concerns about the circumstances under which the documents were signed," he said carefully, "those can be reviewed." I nodded once. "Good," I said, "because I would like everything reviewed." Claire sat back, crossing her arms, her confidence returning, but now edged with something sharper. "There is nothing to review," she said. "This has already been processed through the bank, through the county. It is done." I let out a quiet breath, then reached into my purse and pulled out my phone. I tapped the screen a few times and turned it toward Mr. Lawson. "This is the transaction record," I said. $42,000. Authorized under this document. Processed while I was under post-operative care. Mr. Lawson studied the screen, his expression growing more serious. "That is a significant amount," he said. "Yes," I replied. "And I would like a detailed breakdown of how that number was determined." Claire's voice came in, steady but firmer now. "We already explained that." It was part of the property services. I turned my head slightly toward her. Then you should have no trouble providing an itemized record, I said. Daniel looked between us, his tension now visible. Mom, this is getting complicated, he said. It does not need to be, I replied calmly. All I am asking for is clarity. I gathered the documents in front of me and aligned them neatly, my movements deliberate, controlled. Then I closed my folder with a soft, final sound. I'm not disputing anything today, I said, my tone even. I'm simply making sure I understand every step that was taken. Claire watched me closely now, her earlier certainty no longer as smooth. And once you understand, she asked. I met her gaze, holding it just long enough. Then I will decide how to proceed. Mr. Lawson cleared his throat. It would be reasonable to allow time for document review before any further action, he said. Perhaps we reconvene once all records are compiled. I nodded. That sounds appropriate. Daniel exhaled, as if relieved to have a pause in the tension. Claire did not. She remained still, her eyes fixed on me, searching for something she could not quite find. I stood slowly, gathering my things, careful with my knee, but steady in every other way. Thank you for your time, I said, addressing Mr. Lawson. Then I turned to Daniel and Claire. I will be in touch. I walked out of the room without waiting for a response, the sound of my footsteps quiet against the carpeted hallway. Outside, the morning had fully settled into motion. Cars passing, people moving with purpose. I reached my car and placed the folder on the passenger seat, my hand resting on it for a moment before I started the engine. I had not shown them the codicil. I had not revealed what I knew about the timeline, the coordination, the notary. I had given them just enough space to believe they were still ahead. And as I pulled out into traffic, one thought stayed clear in my mind. The next time we sat at that table, it would not be a conversation about what they had done. It would be a moment where they finally understood what it was going to cost them. I did not head home after leaving the attorney's office. Instead, I drove straight to the Franklin County Recorder's office, a low, government building with wide steps and glass doors that reflected the late morning sun. If Claire believed everything was finalized, then I wanted to see exactly how far that finalization had gone. Inside, the air was cool and quiet, filled with the soft hum of printers and the occasional shuffle of paper. I approached the records counter, where a clerk in a navy sweater looked up from her screen. "How can I help you today?" she asked. I placed my folder gently on the counter. "I need to verify the current ownership status of a residential property," I said, "and I would like certified copies of any recent filings." She nodded and turned to her computer. "Address." I gave it to her, watching carefully as she typed. A few seconds passed, then her expression shifted. Not dramatically, but enough for me to notice. "There was a transfer recorded yesterday afternoon," she said. "Deed has been updated in the system. Yesterday afternoon, after the meeting had already been scheduled, after everything had been set in motion. Can you print that record?" I asked. "Of course." The printer behind her came to life, and a moment later, she handed me a stamped document. I took it and looked down. There was an official county record, grantor Evelyn Harper, grantee Daniel Harper, recorded and finalized. I traced the date with my finger. They had not just prepared the transfer. They had pushed it through completely, making it part of public record before I could even question it in the right room. "Is there anything else you need?" the clerk asked. I looked back up at her. "Yes," I said. "I would also like a copy of the filing history. Any documents submitted with this transfer." She nodded again and began printing additional pages. As I waited, I glanced around the room. A man reviewing blueprints at a side table. A woman arguing quietly on her phone near the door. Ordinary problems, ordinary stakes. Not this. When the clerk returned, she handed me a thicker stack. "These are all associated filings," she said, "including notarization records." "Thank you," I replied. I stepped aside to a small standing desk and began flipping through the pages. And then I saw it. The notary record. Name, Patricia L. Henson. Commission number listed clearly. Time of notarization, 8:42 a.m. Location, private residence. My residence. I paused, my finger resting on the line. 8:42 in the morning. I closed my eyes briefly, replaying the timeline in my head. That was the morning before my surgery. Claire had insisted we go over paperwork early, before heading to the hospital. She had said we'd save time. I opened my eyes and read the next line. Identification verified by third party. Not by me. Directly. By a third party. I straightened slowly, the pieces locking into place with a clarity that felt almost surgical. This was not just about pressure or timing. This was about substitution, about someone standing in for me in a moment that required certainty. I gathered the papers carefully and returned to the counter. "Excuse me," I said. The clerk looked up again. "Yes. Is there a way to contact the notary listed on this document?" I asked, holding up the page. She leaned forward slightly. "There should be a registered address or phone number on file." "Let me check." She typed again, then wrote something down on a small slip of paper. "Here you go," she said. I took it, folding it once before placing it in my purse. "I appreciate your help." Outside, the air felt sharper now, the sunlight brighter against the concrete. I walked down the steps slowly, my knee reminding me of its limits, but my mind moving far ahead of my body. They had not just relied on my trust. They had built a system around my absence. A notary who had not verified me directly. A transfer rushed through before I could question it. A narrative already spread to neighbors. I reached my car and placed the documents on the passenger seat, then sat down behind the wheel. For a moment, I did not start the engine. I simply looked at the notary record again, at the name printed in clean, official type. Patricia Elinson. If she had notarized that document without confirming my identity in person, then the entire foundation of their plan was not just questionable. It was vulnerable. I picked up my phone and dialed the number on the slip of paper. It rang once, twice. Then a voice answered. "This is Patricia." I straightened slightly, my voice calm, precise. "Ms. Henson, my name is Evelyn Harper," I said, "and I believe you notarized a document for me at a time when I was not actually present." There was a pause on the other end of the line, a long one, and in that silence, I knew I had just stepped into the part of this story they never expected me to reach. I did not speak right away after she answered. I let that silence stay between us for just a moment longer, enough to make it clear. This was not a routine call. Then I repeated, slower this time, "You notarized a document for me at a time when I was not actually present." On the other end, I heard a shift, paper moving, a chair creaking slightly. "I'm going to need you to clarify what you mean," Patricia said, her tone careful now, measured. I glanced down at the record in my hand, reading directly from it. August 14th, 8:42 in the morning. Residential notarization. Name listed as Evelyn Harper. Another pause, longer this time. Then she spoke again, more cautious than before. "I did perform a notarization at that time," she said. The client presented identification. Everything appeared to be in order. I leaned back slightly in my seat, my eyes fixed on the document. "Did you personally verify that identification with me?" I asked. Silence. I could hear her breathing now, faint but present. Then, finally, "There was a woman present who introduced herself as you," she said. "She provided documentation. Another individual confirmed her identity." My grip on the paper tightened just slightly. "Another individual," I repeated. "Who?" "A man," Patricia replied. "He said he was your son, Daniel." "Of course." I closed my eyes briefly, then opened them again, sharper now. "And did you ask for direct confirmation from me?" I pressed. "Did you speak to me? Did you compare signatures in front of me?" There was no immediate answer. When she finally spoke, her voice had changed. It was no longer neutral. It carried the weight of realization. "No," she said quietly. "I relied on the representations made at the time." I nodded once, even though she could not see it. "Then I need you to understand something very clearly," I said, my tone steady, precise. "The person you notarized that document for was not me." The silence that followed was immediate and heavy. Then she exhaled, slow and controlled. "If that is the case," she said, "then that notarization may be invalid." "Maybe." I did not correct her. "Not yet. I'm going to request a written statement from you," I continued, "confirming exactly what you just told me." The circumstances, the identification process, and the individuals present. She hesitated. That is a serious request, she said. It is, I agreed. And so, is what was done with that document. Another pause. Then, more firmly, all right, she said. I will need to review my records, but I can provide a statement. Good, I replied. Please include the fact that you did not directly verify my identity in person. I understand, she said. I ended the call without another word. For a moment, I sat there in the car, the engine still off, the document resting in my lap. Then I reached for my phone again and dialed Mr. Green. He answered on the second ring. Evelyn, I have confirmation, I said. The notary did not verify me. She relied on Daniel and another woman presenting themselves as me. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end. That changes everything, he said immediately. It establishes fraudulent execution. The entire chain, power of attorney, deed transfer, can be challenged. I looked down at the papers again, at the signatures, the stamps, the official lines that had seemed so final just hours ago. Not just challenged, I said quietly. Invalidated. He paused, then said yes. Potentially yes. Potentially. I'll let that word pass, because I already knew what this meant. Prepare whatever you need, I continued. I want this documented before our next meeting. We will move quickly, he said. And Evelyn, this gives you leverage. I allowed myself the smallest pause. I already have leverage, I replied. Now I have proof. I ended the call and placed the phone down carefully. Outside, a breeze moved through the trees lining the street, leaves shifting in soft patterns against the light. Everything looked the same, but nothing was the same anymore. They had built their entire plan on a foundation that required me to stay silent, to accept, to not look too closely. And now, with one confirmation, that foundation had a crack running straight through it. I picked up the notary record again, folding it neatly and placing it back into my folder. Then I started the engine, because the next time I sat across from Claire and Daniel, it would not be about explanations. It would not be about misunderstandings. It would be about accountability. And as I pulled out onto the road, one thought stayed with me, clear and undeniable. They thought they had already won. They had no idea they had just signed everything away. I did not wait for another scheduled meeting. By the time I pulled back onto my street, something inside me had shifted past careful strategy and into something far more immediate, far more human. My hands were steady on the wheel, but my chest felt tight, like every breath had to push through something heavier than air. They had not just taken my house. They had stood in my place, signed my name, and erased me while I was preparing for surgery. That was not confusion. That was deliberate. I turned into the driveway, without hesitation, and parked behind Claire's SUV. This time, I did not sit in the car. I opened the door, stepped out, and walked straight up to the front door, ignoring the pull on my knee. The keypad blinked at me again, quiet and indifferent. I raised my hand and knocked. Hard. Once. Twice. The sound echoed through the house I had lived in for over 30 years. A few seconds later, the door opened. Claire stood there, her expression already guarded. Evelyn, we told you we would. Do not. I cut in, my voice sharper than it had been all day. Do not stand in my doorway and pretend this is still a conversation you control. That stopped her. Just for a second. Daniel appeared behind her, his face tightening when he saw me. Mom, what is going on? He asked. I stepped forward, not enough to push past them, but enough that they had to feel my presence, not just hear my voice. What is going on? I said, holding up the notary record in my hand, is that the document you used to take this house was notarized without me being there. Silence. Real silence this time. Claire's expression flickered, then steadied. That is not possible, she said. It is already recorded. I spoke to the notary. I replied, my voice rising despite myself. She confirmed she never verified me. She relied on you. And on him. I pointed directly at Daniel. His face went pale. Mom, wait, he said quickly. We did not. You stood there. I cut in, my voice breaking through the air now, no longer measured, no longer contained. You stood there and let someone sign my name while I was not even present. Claire stepped forward, her tone sharpening. You are overreacting, she said. Everything was done to help you. I let out a short, disbelieving breath. Help me, I repeated. You changed my locks. You moved my belongings. You told people I left. You transferred my house and took $42,000 while I was under medical care. My voice rose with each word, not uncontrolled, but undeniable. Do not tell me this was help. Daniel ran a hand through his hair, his voice unsteady now. We thought it was the best way to handle things, he said. You were going to need support, and the house was mine, I said firmly. It still is. Claire's composure cracked thin, just slightly, her voice tightening. Legally, it is not, she said. It has already been transferred. I stepped closer, close enough that she could not avoid my eyes. Then you might want to reconsider what you think legally means, I said. Because the foundation of that transfer is fraudulent. That word landed. Fraudulent. It hung in the space between us, heavier than anything else that had been said. Daniel looked at Claire, then back at me. What does that even mean? He asked. I held up the document again, my hand steady despite everything inside me. It means the notarization is invalid, I said. It means the power of attorney can be challenged. It means everything you rushed through is now under review. Claire's lips parted slightly, but no words came out. For the first time, she did not have an immediate response. I felt it then. The shift. Not subtle, not theoretical, real. The ground under them had moved. I lowered the paper slowly, my voice quieter now, but far more dangerous in its certainty. You built this entire plan on the assumption that I would not question it, I said. That I would not look closely enough to see what you did. Daniel swallowed hard. Mom, I did not soften. Not now. No, I said. You do not get to call me that and stand on paperwork you know was not done properly. Claire finally spoke, her voice lower, controlled but strained. What are you planning to do? I held her gaze, every word deliberate. I'm going to undo everything you did, I said, and then we're going to talk about what it costs you. The wind moved lightly through the trees behind me, but nothing about this moment felt light. Daniel looked between us, his uncertainty now fully exposed. Claire said nothing, and as I stood there, in front of the house they thought they had taken, I realized something with absolute clarity. This was no longer about proving what they had done. That part was already in motion. The next step was deciding how far I was willing to take it, and whether they had any idea what was about to happen next. I did not step back from that doorway. Not anymore. For the first time since all of this began, I was not the one being pushed out. I was the one standing my ground, and they could feel it. Claire tried to recover first, her voice lower now, controlled but edged with something sharper. You are making this worse than it needs to be, she said. We can still resolve this privately. I let out a short, almost incredulous breath. Privately, I repeated, you forged control over my life while I was preparing for surgery, and now you want privacy. Daniel shifted beside her, his voice breaking through, strained and uncertain. Mom, please, let's just sit down and figure this out. I turned to him, and for a moment, I saw the boy he used to be. Then I remembered the man who had stood beside someone impersonating me. You already figured it out, I said. You just did not expect me to catch up. Before either of them could respond, a car pulled up behind mine. I did not need to turn around and know who it was. I had made the call 15 minutes earlier, right after I left Mr. Green's office. The engine shut off, doors opened, and footsteps approached across the driveway. I stepped slightly to the side as Officer Ramirez and another officer walked up, their presence calm but unmistakable. Ma'am, Ramirez said to me with a nod. You called about a possible fraud case? Claire froze. Daniel's head snapped toward the officers. What is this? He asked. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. This is the consequence, I said. I handed Officer Ramirez the folder, already organized, documents in order. The power of attorney was executed without my verified presence. The notarization has been verbally confirmed as improperly conducted. The property transfer and financial transactions stem from that document. Ramirez flipped through the pages, his expression shifting as he read. Ma'am, he said to Claire, we're going to need to ask you a few questions. Claire straightened, her composure cracking for the first time in a way she could not hide. This is a misunderstanding, she said quickly. Everything was done legally. Ramirez did not look up from the documents. That is what we are here to determine, he replied. The second officer turned to Daniel. Sir, we need you to step aside for a moment. Daniel looked at me, panic now fully visible. Mom, you did not have to call the police, he said. I met his eyes, steady, unyielding. You did not have to pretend to be me, I replied. That ended it. The illusion, the control, the careful framing they had built. It all collapsed in that moment. Claire tried again, her voice sharper now, almost desperate. Evelyn, think about what you were doing. This is your family. I took a step forward, my voice low but carrying every ounce of truth I had left. No, I said, family does not erase you and call it help. Officer Ramirez closed the folder and looked directly at Claire. Ma'am, based on what we have here, we're going to need you to come with us for further questioning regarding potential fraud and misrepresentation. Claire's face went pale. You cannot be serious, she said. We can, he replied calmly. The second officer gestured toward the driveway. Please. Daniel stepped forward, his voice breaking. There has to be another way, he said. We can fix this. I turned to him one last time. You already chose your way, I said. This is mine. Claire hesitated for 1 second too long, then finally stepped forward, her posture no longer controlled, no longer composed. As the officers guided her toward the car, she did not look at me again. Daniel stood frozen in the driveway, his hands at his sides, everything he thought he had secured slipping out from under him in real time. The house behind him, the one they rushed to take, no longer looked like a victory. It looked like evidence. I turned back to the front door, the keypad still blinking softly. The same door, the same frame. But now, everything had shifted back into alignment. Mr. Green's voice echoed in my mind, calm and certain. This gives you leverage. No, this gave me resolution. Within 48 hours, the legal process moved quickly. The notarization was formally challenged. The power of attorney was suspended pending investigation. The deed transfer was frozen, and the financial accounts were flagged. Claire was not walking back into that house. Not as an owner. Not as anything. Daniel received formal notice the same afternoon. Temporary control revoked. Full review pending. Potential civil liability attached. He stood in the same driveway 2 days later, holding papers he did not understand, looking at a door he could no longer claim. I stood inside that house again, in the same living room where I had spent decades building a life, holding a different set of papers. Mine. Verified. Restored. The armchair by the window was still slightly out of place, the photographs not yet returned to their proper spots. But the space felt like mine again, not because of memory, because of truth. I walked to the front door and looked out through the glass. Daniel was still there, standing uncertainly, as if waiting for something that was not coming. I opened the door just enough to meet his eyes. You should leave, I said. No anger, no hesitation, just finality. He swallowed, nodded once, and turned away. I closed the door gently behind him, the sound soft but absolute. And as I stood there, hand resting on the frame they tried to take from me, one thing was clear. They did not just lose the house. They lost the right to ever stand inside it again.